We continue this week in our study, and as we talk about the vision of our church, as we talk about the new year that's ahead of us, the past couple of weeks I've been trying to drive home this idea that God desires for us to be a congregation, that desires to be a church that not only just exists for the sake of existing and worshiping God, but that we would exist in order that we may influence and cause some sort of an impact in the community, in the society in which we exist. And so we've been talking a lot about in the past couple of weeks, how do we do that? You know, what is God's heart? What is God doing? And how does God desire for us to do that? And last week we kind of looked at how God desires in our living, the way that we live our lives, not just in the big things, but in the small things, how we do our day-to-day business, how we go about our demeanor, our personalities, the way that we invest, the way that we serve. How does this all picture the church? And God was showing us and shaping us in different ways. So this morning I want to go a little bit more practical and talk a little bit more. So towards the end of January and going to next week, you'll see that it's going to get more and more practical. We started the new year with this large vision, and now we're trying to get more and more specific about exactly how it is that God is trying to shape us and what God desires. And so this morning, as we look from the text in Romans chapter 12, we find this excerpt in part of Paul's letter, the Apostle Paul's letter to the church in Rome. Right? He's writing to the church in Rome, and in the first 12 or 11 chapters, Paul is kind of giving the church in Rome a theological basis of why they're supposed to live the way that they're supposed to. Okay? Paul explains to them, this is the reason why we believe in Jesus. This is why Jesus came to die for us. And he gives a lengthy discussion about what it is that we're trying to do, what the gospel is, how we're supposed to live our lives. So Paul, in writing this letter in the first 11 chapters, he flushes it all out. And then starting in chapter 12, the Apostle Paul actually goes very specific and he says, okay, now church in Rome, listen carefully. First 11 chapters, I wanted to tell you this is why we do it. Now this is how the people of God are supposed to look like. And so starting in chapter 12, he says, the marks of the Christian community. So if the Christian community understands the gospel correctly, then the Christian community should look like this. And here are some characteristics of the Christian community. And so in chapter 12, he starts listing these things out. He says, hey, live this way, do that. And then he says, this is what the picture of the church, the Christian community, is supposed to be like. We're not going to look specifically or spend a whole lot of time in each one, but I want to run through them for you. They go starting from chapter 12 all the way to verse 9. You'll see it, and even past that, it goes to verse 1 to 21. You see these characteristics, these marks of a Christian community, okay? And I want to run through them really quickly. The first thing that Paul says is that a Christian community, if you look in verse 3 in chapter 12, and like I said, all of these characteristics will span from chapter 12, verse 1 to verse 21. But one of the first things that Paul says that a Christian community is supposed to resemble is that of humility. One of humility. He says, hey, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, but in sober judgment, be humble. Be humble with one another. Be humble in the presence of God. Show humility to each other. Okay? Throughout the passage, he says, hey, don't think that you're better than anyone else and associate with one person or another regarding your socioeconomic status or whatever it is that you find yourself in the community, but be humble. What? In light of who God is. Because who God is, make sure you understand who you are and to love one another in all sense, in such ways. And then he goes on to say that the next mark of a Christian community is not only one that is humble and is able to understand and to love one another, but is one that understands that each of us are made up of different body parts, right? He uses these examples, just like how a human body is made up with many parts. The feet, we have the feet, the legs, the hands, the arms, the chest, the heart, the lungs, the brain, the eyes, ears, nose, mouth. Like the body has all these different body parts, the church, the characteristics of the Christian church is one that is supposed to resemble that of the body. Meaning that they're supposed to be people of different gifts and different talents in the church. People in the church aren't supposed to look all like the same. We're not supposed to behave the same. We're not supposed to have the same gifts. We're not supposed to have the same talents. And you see, the thing is, when people come to church, for some reason, we all think that we need to assimilate and become like one another. We have to talk the same way, we have to dress the same way, we have to enjoy the same kinds of things, we have to have the same ideas of what it means to have a hobby or a pastime, but it's different. What the Apostle Paul says is if you understand the way that God gifts people and blesses people, then you will know that each person has different gifts. And that is to be celebrated. Because why? It makes it to be one complete picture. You know, my mom used to always tell me, okay, she used to always say, in anything, there has to be one and the other. And she used to always say to me, if there's somebody that's really, really smart, then there has to be someone that's really, really not smart. Okay? Because if everybody is really, really smart, then no one would be smart. Right? And she used to say the same thing. If somebody is to be really, really good looking, there needs to be someone who is really, really not good looking. Okay? Because if everybody was good looking, then no one would be good looking. She was telling me this when I lost my first basketball game. I remember I came home, I was pretty upset. It was a very close game. And she says, you know, in life, there's always one and the other. And the reason why there are some losers, people who don't win, and some people who do win, is because if everybody won, then you wouldn't know what it means to lose and to win. The way that the church is made up is not because God is trying to highlight one or the other, but it's like, if only when we have all the collection of the parts do we see the full picture of what God is trying to do. Some of us in this room, we're good at hospitality. We're good at welcoming people. Others of us, we really don't like people very much. Right? When we see human beings, it kind of scares us. Right? When we have to meet strangers, it's kind of an uncomfortable thing. Others of us, you can't get enough of strangers. You just want to be around people that you don't know. It's a different picture. But Paul says a Christian church is one that represents all of this. Not only humility, but one of all different types of gifts coming together for one purpose. The second thing he says is that the church is one that is marked with love. Okay? Is motivated by love. I won't spend a whole lot of time because this, it can get very long, but he says this is absolutely necessary in the characteristics of a church. That everything that we do has to be from the basis of love. Right? And then he goes on to say, right, another characteristic of the church is when people are passionate. There's passion, there's zeal in the community of God. So there's humility, there's different gifts, there's love, and there's passion. Okay? And then he says, another characteristic of the Christian community is one of patience. That when you come to a church, one of the characteristics of the church is that it demonstrates patience. Not only just for one another, but patience in circumstances, patience in prayer. And then he goes on to say, another characteristic of the church is one that is hospitable, that practice hospitality. That when people come to our church, when people come into a Christian community, they know automatically that they are welcome, that they don't feel like an outsider. I took a class at seminary some time ago in evangelism, and the professor said this. He said, in the church, in the United States, the motto, so meaning the slogan for a lot of the churches, our church is welcome to anybody, but you have to come to us. Okay? They said the motto for many churches in the United States is this: our church is open for anyone. It doesn't matter what race, what color, what language, what culture, what age, whoever you are, you're welcome, but you have to come to us. And once they come to us, you have to find a group that you belong to. And once you find a group that you belong to, you have to prove that you belong in that group. It's kind of like what we always talk about, the church has become some sort of social club, some sort of country club where you have to have a certain requirement, a certain place. And not only, I'll tell you one thing, okay? Country clubs, they never send out invitations. You ever notice that? You never get spam mail in your Gmail, in your inbox, or in your letter where saying country clubs like, hey, can you be a member? What do you have to do? You have to go and apply. You have to go find it. The characteristic of the church, Paul says, is not one that says, hey, we're open and you come. It's one of open hospitality, meaning that we go out and see people. When people come, they feel welcome, they feel at home, they feel like one, not because they have to prove themselves, but because it is one that is characterized by love. He goes on to say again, another characteristic of the church is one that understands that we love, we bless even those that persecute us. Right? Forgive, we love, and we bless even those people that persecute us, that challenge us. So meaning what? A characteristic of the church is a group of people that understand what Christ did for us. Bless those that persecute you, living a radical lifestyle. This characteristic, you don't know how difficult it is until you actually have to do it. You don't know how difficult it is until you actually have to do it. When somebody spits in your face, if you can say, I still love you and care for you. If someone borrows money from you and deliberately steals it from you, doesn't pay you back, then you can go to that person and say, I still love you, I care for you, I pray for you. He goes on, there are many characteristics, okay, from verse 1 to 21. So love your enemies. Another one, he says, is that a church, a Christian community, is one that is able to rejoice and mourn, meaning is one that can empathize and sympathize with one another. It is where people, when they come, they don't have to feel like, oh, I'm ashamed of what's going on. Because why? When people hear about one another, when they hear about the different stories, they understand. They can sit with people and not feel uncomfortable. They can go to someone who's sick and say, I want to spend time with you. I want to love you. I want to care for you. I want to be compassionate with you. When I was in high school, my junior year, I used to volunteer at a hospital. At first, I did it because my high school guidance counselor said it would look good on my resume, so I did it. And that was my first motivation. I went. And the place that I got placed at the hospital was at the ICU. I was placed at the ICU. And the ICU stands for what? The intensive care unit, right? So either people come out from surgery and they're still in intensive care, or they just come from the emergency room. Basically, it means what it stands for. It means that somebody who's in an intensive care needing place. Okay, they're in a place where they need 24-hour surveillance. They need a lot of help in order for them to maintain their health. So I'm there, and I'm working with these different just nurses and doing whatever I need to do. One of the most difficult things that I had to do was when the nurse told me, hey, can you go to room 23B or whatever it is? There's an old man there. He's got no family. He's not feeling well. He doesn't really have a long time. Just go and sit there and talk to him. As a junior in high school, you will not believe how difficult that was. I opened the door, I sat next to this guy, I think his name was Frank or something like that. I sat next to him, and you know what? For the first 30 seconds, it was great. I'm like, hi Frank, my name is David, I'm here to volunteer, this is what I do. I told him about my family, and after about a minute or so, I have nothing else to say. And Frank's just sitting there looking at me. He must have been like 60, 70 years old. Not many more days left, and he's just looking at me, and he doesn't say anything. He's just looking, he's just staring, he's just looking into my eyes, waiting for me to say something, and I'm like, what do I do? And after about 5 minutes of kind of just being like, oh yeah, you know, weather's nice, this is good, you know, you like the hospital food? Do you want me to change the temperature for you, or change the channel? I said, okay Frank, I'll be right back, I need to use the bathroom. This whole idea of being able to sit with someone, to understand, to just be in their presence, it's very uncomfortable. It's more difficult than you actually think it is. But Paul says a characteristic of a church, characteristic of a community, is one that is able to do this. Because why? It's second nature. You know what I realize now? Frank didn't want me to say anything. When I look back, he didn't want me to say anything. Of course, it would have been nice if I was a little bit more outgoing. I could have told him some stories, made him laugh perhaps, told him some jokes or whatever it is. But Frank really just wanted me to be there. He just wanted me to sit there. Wanted me to just be by his side. Let him know, hold his hand. Let him know that there's somebody there to just understand him, to walk with him through this journey. Paul says a Christian community is one that can understand this, and one that does this in action. Another characteristic. It says a Christian community is one that is united, not divided, doesn't have cliques, doesn't have different groups, married families, family with kids, families without kids, young people in college, young professionals that are graduating, youth students. They say a church, a picture of a Christian community is one where everyone is united in one. You know, in Acts, when the church first got started, they met in churches or in houses. You know what that meant? That meant in a house, you could have children like my kids, young kids, toddlers, babies, all the way up to 60, 70, 80, 90-year-old people, and they would all be in one room worshiping together. And that was the picture of the church. And each person was united in one cause. I don't know when the division started happening, but in Korean churches, we're awesome at dividing age groups. We are. If you're a certain age group, you have to be in youth group. From 6 to 12 in high school, you got to be in youth group. From anywhere from college up until Lord knows when, if you speak English, then you're supposed to be in English ministry. If you're between the ages of elementary school, whatever, you're in Sunday school. We're awesome at dividing, but you know what Paul says? Paul says that the Christian church is one that is able to celebrate differences and to be united in one, regardless of generation, regardless of age. Lastly, and perhaps one of the most powerful statements towards the end of chapter 12, Paul says the characteristic of the church is its ability to forgive. It's its ability to forgive one another, people in our community, family members, each other, ourselves, our past, people that we don't know. It's our ability to forgive. So let me ask this to you. As we are a church, two questions. One, how well do we do in light of what Paul says a Christian community is supposed to be like? And two, what would our church, and not just our church, what would the church look like if each of these characters, if each of these markers were so prevalent, so profoundly available, so profoundly alive in the church of God? So let me review. Okay? What would the churches look like if every church you walked in, not just Lighthouse Christian Fellowship, but any church you walked in, the first thing you felt was humility, and then you felt people working in different groups with different talents, that there was love, that there was passion, there was patience with one another, there was hospitality, there was loving your enemies, living like Christ did, there was compassion and mourning and empathy, there was unity, and then there was forgiveness. What would this church, what would our church, what would the church look like? Because this is the picture that Paul is painting. And these are the characteristics that Paul lays out. Out of these three, though, I want to focus on three specific ones this morning that I think pertains particularly to our church. Okay, so these are the ones that he covers all in chapter 12. But out of these, I want to focus on our scripture reading, verse 9 to 13. And I want to highlight three characteristics that I think our church needs to develop. Okay, that I think would transform and really push us into the church that God desires us to be. First thing, let's look at verse 12, verse 11. Okay, Paul says, never be lacking in zeal. So he's talking about the Christian community. He says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Basically, this is the whole characteristic of being passionate in serving God. Having a passion and a desire, burning desire to be serving God. You know what's interesting? It says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor. This word fervor in the original language actually means for it to boil, to be hot. So it's actually describing like water when it boils, or when a stovetop is hot. So what Paul is saying is never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor. It means that be boiling inside. On your inside, in your desire to serve God, it's got to be on fire. It's got to be hot like a stovetop that's been left on high, like a water that's boiling. Let it be boiling, overflowing from the inside. Let your passion never be lacking. So the question that I have for this morning is, how do we do that? How do we sustain our passion? How do we have this boiling desire within us to serve God? And the answer is in chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, in the ways that Paul begins this chapter as he says these are the characteristics. And he says in verse 1, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy. How do we do any of these characteristics? How is the church supposed to resemble these things that Paul says? How are we supposed to have a boiling desire? Is if we have a correct view of God's mercy in our lives. I think we make a big mistake, okay, in our personal lives if you try to personally muster up, meaning that you try to motivate yourself like this, psych yourself up. I was watching, it's NFL playoff season for those of you guys that are following football. And today is actually a big day for football, and all the divisional championships are happening and things like that. And I was watching ESPN, and I'm watching about these two linebackers on the Ravens, the Baltimore Ravens. And this guy, if you know anything about football players, they're giants. They're huge. Okay? This guy is 6'6", 380 pounds or something like that. He's a monster. not only is he a monster, if you look at his face, he looks like, he just looks angry all the time. Right? And even when he's smiling, it looks like he's angry smiling. I mean, he's just not someone that you want to be on the angry side. Okay? This is what he says he does before every game. In order to set the passion, right, to get him going, to get him ready for the game, this is what he does. He goes to his athletic trainer of his team. He goes to his athletic trainer of his team, okay? And this is what this is what he says, okay? The athletic trainer, who is 6 foot, so he's not a short guy, but he's only 6 foot, maybe 200 some pounds, so he's not big. This guy is 6'6", 380, he's huge. The athletic trainer will take his hand and slap him across the face as hard as he can 5 times. He will slap it back and forth 5 times. And he says this big 6'6", 380 pound guy, every time he gets slapped, he goes, rah, rah, rah. And then afterwards he's ready, because why? He's angry, he's motivated. He's like, I'm going to break somebody today. I think many of us make this mistake when we think about having passion for God. We try and muster it up, and we do whatever we need to do. We go to conferences, we have revivals, we have different things. And it's the same thing that this linebacker does. It's like, hey, slap me, do something, punch me, motivate me, get me going, wake me up. But I think we have it mixed up, because what God is saying is, what Paul is saying through God is the way that we stay spiritually on fire, meaning boiling for God, is if we have a correct view of God's mercy in our lives. If you understand what Jesus did for you and I on the cross, that in itself is enough motivation for us to get going. We don't need someone to be slapping us. We don't need to be going to another conference. We don't need to have a special speaker or see a special movie or whatever it is. If you see and understand what the cross means for us in our lives, it fires us up, it boils us. Because why? We see that we're not deserving, and yet God says, I choose you. We shouldn't be forgivable, but God says, I forgive you. And it motivates us. It sets us on fire. And notice what Paul says. To offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. Because why? In view of God's mercy. Meaning that if you understand what God has done for you in your life, and you live passionately because of what God did for you in your life, this is your true and proper worship. Only when you understand it is motivated by what God did. You know, many of us serve in many different ways in our church. Right? We have people that serve in the worship team. We have people who serve with us with doing finances and accounting. We have people that serve as elders and decision makers and all this stuff. But you know what? This is what Paul says, and I think this is what God is saying through Paul. Unless what we're doing for God is motivated by what God has done for us, God doesn't consider that to be proper worship. It doesn't matter how much you psych yourself up, how much passion you try to muster, if it's not motivated simply by every single morning we wake up and we say, God, oh my goodness, it's amazing that your son will die for me, and I am overwhelmed by it, and so I will do what it is that you call me to do. Unless that is the motivation, Paul says, and what I think God is telling us is, it's not proper worship. Because it's kind of like that linebacker trying to psych himself up. Our spiritual fervor, our passion, comes from having a proper understanding of God's mercy in our lives. And if that's real for you and I, then you will know how that passion will burn within you. How that desire will burn within you. I used to have a youth pastor who would say this. He said, can you imagine what the church would be like if each and every single time that Satan tempts you, right? And say you have this addiction or whatever it is, and you're trying to quit, but Satan tempts you, and then you fall into temptation and you commit a sin. What do most people do? Most people get sad, they get depressed, they have a pity party, they're like, oh man, I'm such a horrible person, or gosh, I can't believe I did it again, and all this stuff, right? This youth pastor used to tell me all the time, he's like, Dave, think about this. If you understand what Jesus did for you, imagine if instead of when people fail, going, oh gosh, I'm such a horrible person, how could I do that, and being guilty, if each and every single time they failed, instead of having a pity party, if the people of God would get up and get angry at Satan, and instead of being demotivated, meaning instead of being defeated, if they would get more fired up, can you imagine what the enemy would do? He would stop tempting us. If instead of each and every time we get tempted and we fail, we get all this pity party, we're like, oh man, we can't do this. In view of God's mercy, knowing that even when we fail, God forgives us, and even when we fail, God restores us, even when we fail, God loves us, if we would stand up and get angry and say, each and every single time you tempt me, I'm going to get fired up, because why? God's mercy says so. Can you imagine what this church would be like? That's what Paul's saying. That's what God's saying. And that's what He's trying to tell us in view of God's mercy. When we understand the mercy of God in our lives, we don't have to try to motivate ourselves. It'll come welling like a boiling water from within us. You know, brothers and sisters, this church, this building, is probably one of the nicest church buildings I've ever been a pastor at or served at. And for those of you that are somewhat new, I used to lead worship for this church for quite a few years. And one of the things that I love most about this sanctuary is the acoustics. As someone who does music, the room in this sanctuary is perfect, because why? The sounds echo perfectly. It's beautiful in here. One of my favorite sounds in the world, and I think this is one of the things that keeps me from doing, drives me to continue to do things like SEMA or go to revivals or speak at revivals. One of my favorite sounds in the world is when the church is filled with the sounds of God's people worshiping passionately. That's the most beautiful thing to me. We have this church. We have a God that loves us. And God says the people of God will not be lacking in passion, in worship, in singing, in serving, in living. Why? Not for anything else. In view of God's mercy. And when we do it in view of God's mercy, God says this is your proper act of worship. This is the image that I get when I think of someone who has a passionate worship. You know, I used to make fun of I know lots of violinists who are friends of mine who are very good. And have you ever been to a concert when you see a violinist and everything they do is so exaggerated? You ever seen that? I used to think, I'm like, man, that's just, I'm like, what are you doing, man? You're like seeking attention. You know what I realized? It's not any of those things. They're just passionate. They just love it. They just love it so much that everything that they do is just accentuated. It's like over the top. Because why? They're motivated for the right things. They don't care what people think. They don't care how much drinking and doing all this stuff. Sometimes I wish our church would worship like this. When I would, I stay in the back, try to help with the PowerPoint and stuff. I pray sometimes. I walk in, I'm thinking, gosh, it'd be crazy if our church would worship like that. When the worship team is singing and things like that, you see people going, because we understand why we do it. Because worship isn't just to get us in the mood of listening to God's word, right? It's in view of God's mercy, singing in the freedom that God gives us. So that's the first thing that Paul says. In view of God's mercy, live with spiritual fervor, meaning having passion that boils over inside of your hearts. Second thing he says in verse 12 is be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Read that again. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. It's separated into three parts, is it not? The first part is joyful in hope, meaning what? There is hope for us. And when we see that hope, we must rejoice in it, right? That we have hope in Christ. But the second two parts I want to address your attention It says, be patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Think about this. If we weren't to go through affliction as the Christian community, meaning that being part of being Christian doesn't involve suffering, doesn't involve affliction, then why would Paul bother to say that in his prayer about what a church is supposed to be like? If praying isn't something that tests our patience, meaning that when you pray, you don't just get things like this, like a zap from God that just goes immediate, why would Paul say you have to be patient in prayer? Paul says these things because this is a characteristic of what it means to be a church. It means that when we are a Christian community, yes, we have joy that we've celebrated and our hope that we have in Christ. But two, there will be affliction, there will be pain, there will be suffering. That is a common characteristic of the Christian community. And yet, we must be what? Patient through it. And faithful in prayer. You know, I think the most difficult thing about being patient, about being faithful, and continuing on is not when we get what we desire. Right? It makes sense? It's the most difficult thing is when we don't get what we want, and particularly when things don't happen in the timing that we want. When we disagree with God's timing, when certain things happen in our lives that we can't understand, when certain afflictions, certain difficulties happen in our lives, that's the worst timing, right? Worst possible timing. You can't think of why this is happening at this time. For the Christian church, for the community, for the believers to be able to say, God, I trust you in patience. And through it, as we pray, to be faithful in prayer. Faithful in prayer. I think I shared this testimony with you before. The one thing that I remember of my grandmother is that she prayed all the time. She prayed all the time. Before she passed away, in Chicago, my grandparents, they used to own a prayer, like a kidoan, like a retreat prayer site. And they used to own that property as part of the church. And so they lived there. And we would love going there because it's a huge property, it's a huge lake, there's a big field, there's always animals coming by, and it was always fun, and we'd always do crazy things. And so family would go on vacation there and hang out with our grandparents. And I remember in the middle of the night, one night, I was there, I'm sleeping, I wake up because it's pitch black, in the middle of nowhere, the lights are all turned off, it's pitch black, and I hear something weird at the corner of the room. Okay, so I wake up, we're sleeping in the living room, and in the corner of that side of the living room, there's no lights turned on. I hear someone like, I'm like, what in the world? So I wake up my brother, I'm like, there's a demon over there. There's something crazy going on over there. It's scary in the middle of nowhere, and all I hear is this creepy voice. Can't even really hear it. So my brother and I, we find the flashlight, and we're kind of like trembling over there, and I get scared because why? My grandmother, she turns, and she's like, what are you doing? Right? And I'm like, the lights aren't turned on. What are you doing here? And she said, this is what she was doing. She was, I don't know for how long, but she says, I'm memorizing the Bible. You're memorizing the Bible? Why don't you just turn it on and read it? Why do you have to memorize it? She had the Bible right open. She says, I'm memorizing it because I know my eyesight is going away. And when I can't see it, I want to be able to read it from my mind. And I remember I went back to sleep for the next couple of hours. She'd be memorizing scripture from the top of her head, reading, praying. I remember going to my mom because I was praying for a friend of mine who's non-Christian, and I said, guys, Mom, I've been praying for a year or two and nothing is happening. What's going on? And she says to me, you've been praying for 1 or 2 years? Your Henry's been praying for 75. When things don't happen exactly as fast, if there was one thing I could change about the Bible, that's one thing I could change, right? That there would be immediate things. Immediate gifts, immediate consequences. Don't you think that would make your life a lot easier? Right? Not only when you pray for something good, you're like, God bless me with something happens immediately, but at the same time, when you do something bad, you get an immediate, zap from heaven. Wouldn't that make your life a lot easier instead of having to wait till Judgment Day, right? You do something wrong and all of a sudden, oh, sorry, God, right? mark of the church. Passion, understanding of the mercy of God. At the same time, understanding that we live in this world, that there will be joy because of the hope that we have, but there will be affliction, and that we need to be patient, and that we need to be faithful in prayer. Last thing, he says in 13, share with the Lord's people who are in need, practice hospitality. You know, for Jesus' time, when Jesus and Paul is teaching this, hospitality was not an option. Being hospitable didn't mean when you had the means. It didn't mean that when you had money, you invited people, or when you had time, you invited people. Because if you didn't show hospitality to your fellow Christian brothers and sisters, the gospel could not be spread. Hospitality was the basis of why the Christian message spread throughout Asia at the time of Jesus. Let me give you an example. Remember in Mark 6, we studied Mark last year, and we were talking about how Jesus sent out the disciples, right? He says, now go practice, try the different things that I've taught you. This is the commandment that Jesus gives to his disciples, right? These are his instructions. Take nothing for the journey except the staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. He says to his disciples, don't take anything that you don't need. All you take is what you're wearing, and don't take any extra money, don't take any food, because why? Once you go, the commandment of the people of God is to be hospitable. When they see other Christian brothers and sisters, they're supposed to welcome you into your home. It is a commandment of God. It wasn't an option, it was a necessity. It's something that people did. And so when you see people random strangers who proclaim the word of God, disciples of Jesus would walk in, random people would come and say, I'm a Christian, come stay at my house. I'll feed you, I'll give you a place to sleep, I'll give you a place to shower. Stay as long as you want. That's how the gospel message got spread. And so when Paul is looking at the church in Romans, he's saying, practice hospitality, because if you don't, then our pastors, our missionaries, our evangelists will have no place to stay, and they won't be able to do the work that they're doing. In our 21st century, hospitality is extra credit. It's something that we do when we have time after we have everything else that we do. And you know, this was a lot easier to say for me before I had started having kids. Now that I have kids, having people over is more difficult than I ever imagined. Not only do I have to worry about them going to sleep and waking up and my guests not waking them up, the other thing I'm thinking about is I don't want people I don't know to come into my house when my kids are sleeping. It's not easy. But at the same time, we can't deny the fact that what God says, hospitality is a staple in which the gospel was spread, because when you show hospitality, the gospel workers are able to bless other people. In our church, in our society, showing hospitality can be one of the most radical things, I believe, that we as a church can do. Meaning that you take in someone, that you invite people over, that you have dinner, that you share meals, that you share time together. Not because you have, who has time? I mean, if you have like 20 hours a week that you can just kill, raise your hand and we'd love to come over. I know that's not the case. It's not the case for me. And even for students are busy. But the command that God gives for the people of God and the community of God is one that says, be hospitable because it's not a choice. Be hospitable because, remember what Jesus says? What you do to the least of these, you've done unto me. Something as simple as opening your home. That safe place to invite somebody for a meal, for a conversation. A mark of a church that Paul states. For me, this is, again, hard because of what the church or what the home resembles for me. And maybe it's because I grew up away from my parents in a boarding school and whatever else, and lived by myself. Home is a very private space. And maybe the other part of it is because I'm so OCD, I don't want people coming and messing things up, right? I just like my home to be the way that it is. When I married Hannah, it was the most difficult thing that I had to do, not because she's a horrible person, but because she's totally opposite in her understanding of a home. She wants to buy a big house, not because she wants to have a lot of rooms, but she wants to have people over all the time. And I'm like, no. I don't want people over all the time. This is private. This is my space. Well, I don't want people. And when we used to live in D.C., we lived in a tiny, our apartment, my apartment in D.C. was the size of the LCF office. And that included the bedroom, the dining room, the bathroom, and everything. Literally, I think the LCF office might have been actually bigger than my apartment. Some of my college kids that came to visit, they know. It was tiny. Hannah used to want to have people over there all the time. It would drive me crazy. I'm like, I can't even escape. Where am I going to go? There's nowhere. If you invite people here, they're everywhere. Where am I? I'm going to sit in the bathroom for 3 hours until people... I mean, what am I going to do? Home is a very private place, and so it's difficult, but I think a lot of us have that understanding. Home is where you escape. Home is where you get away. Home is where you have a private moment. Home is where you can just be yourself. God says, that's where you need to open up. That's what you need to open up. You have to be uncomfortable. You have to be okay of having people come into your place, your private place, opening up, blessing other people, serving other people. You know what? As much as it is difficult for me when I have people over, I've gotten so much better, and I think that's why God made me marry Hannah, right? What a horrible pastor would I be if I never invited people to come to my house? Sorry, you can't come. You're too dirty, too messy, sorry. But every single time they come, when they leave, I feel so blessed. Just from the fact that I see their face. Especially when I invite college students over to my house and I feed them. It's amazing. They're like, oh my gosh, it's the first real meal I've had in weeks. It's great. Hospitality is marked in the church. So Paul lays out all of these different things. He has all these different characteristics. And for us, I believe there's 3 things that we really need for us to work on. Is passion, being patient, faithful in prayer. And let's, understand me properly when I say being hospitable. I'm not just talking about people that we know. I'm saying being hospitable in our communities. We have a Happy Hearts daycare center that works here Monday through Friday, have their own staff. And, I'm ashamed to say, I'm not sure if any of us know any of the staff people's names that work there. Think about it, they're in our house Monday through Friday. They actually stay here in our church more than we do. I think God is challenging us. Look, the mark of a Christian community is hospitality, not just to our friends, but to all those around us. The question that I have, though, as we close is this. What keeps us from becoming like this? What keeps us from becoming this church? What keeps us from living out these characteristics, that these characteristics become our characteristics? What keeps us? What prevents us? There's a phenomenon that I recently heard and read about on the radio that is happening in this generation and particularly in the United States. And they call it the something like the open door, open opportunity or something like that. Meaning that there is a tendency for every American to desire to have as many options available as possible. Okay? So when you talk to young people, especially people who are applying for college or applying for a job, it's not like it used to be where you apply to one. So when I was applying for college, I applied for one school. Okay, that was it. I applied for one school. If I got in, great. If I didn't, then I would apply for another one. And it wasn't just me being irresponsible. That's how everybody did it. Okay? Besides, you always had exceptions who would apply for many schools. But for the most part, people apply for one school. Nowadays, if you ask somebody how many schools you apply for, on average, is about 6. On average. The most I've ever heard one person apply for colleges graduating from high school is 18. 18 colleges. You know it costs $50 to $100 for each application? To send in an application. It doesn't even matter if you get accepted or not or rejected or whatever. Just to send in an application, it costs that much money. 18 schools. And you know what? I'm like, what do you... Each school, back in the day, you had to write one essay. Now you have to write 3, 4, maybe 6 essays per school. Meaning that this one individual who applied for 18 schools potentially wrote more than 30 essays. I look at this person, I'm like, why? What's the matter with you? Why would you do that? And this is that I want to keep my options open. It doesn't even matter if they get into the #1 school of their choice. They still want to make sure they have all options available. Same thing with workplaces. Nowadays, my friends, they don't just apply for one company, they apply for many companies. Because why? They want to keep their options open. And because of this open opportunity kind of mindset, guess what? They say Americans now in this generation are the hardest people to get commitments out of. No one will commit to anything, and especially in the church, no one will commit to anything. You tell someone, can you commit for a year to do something? No one will do anything. Because why? Their answer is, I want to keep my options open. What if I commit to Bible study every Thursday night and all of a sudden something happens on Thursday night that I have to go to? I don't want to tie myself down. I want to keep my options open. What if I commit to serving something or doing something the way that God wants for an entire year and something comes up and I can't leave because of my commitment? Now I want to keep my options open. They say in the church the hardest thing to get is commitments because no one wants to commit to tie themselves down to anything because why? They're trying to keep their options open. But let me ask you a question. How many of you keep your options open when you pay your mortgage every month? You go to your bank, you're like, you know what, I really don't want to get tied down with this date, so I'm thinking about sometime in March I'll pay you. Or you go to your boss and your boss says, you have a deadline here, this date, every month you have to give me this paper or you have to turn this assignment in. And you're like, oh, you know what, I like to keep my options open, so let's not put a hard deadline, let's think about some other day. The real world doesn't work that way. The real world has deadlines, it has commitments. You have to do it in order to survive. Bank payments, credit card payments, deadlines, your responsibility in the workplaces. But when it comes to the church, we're saying, hey, let's keep our options open. Don't want to commit to anything. I believe that our church has the potential to do all the things that Paul says and then some. I believe with all of my heart. I've seen enough being in this church. I've seen the hospitality, the grace, the compassion, the generosity, whatever it is, the characteristic that Paul says, I've seen it demonstrated in this church. And this year, as I've been doing since the beginning of the new year, I'm calling for people to commit, to say, I make a commitment to say this, that I'm in. I don't care about keeping my options open. In the view of God's mercy, in view of what God has done for me, as I see the passion, the spiritual fervor, I'm in. Count me in. Regardless of what happens, I'm in. I'm committed. If we have a group of people committed, brothers and sisters, I believe without a doubt that this church can be more than what the Apostle Paul says here. That these characteristics of a Christian community will just be given. That our church, every single time somebody walks in, will be one of humility, would be one of different gifts, different people working in different situations, one of love, one of passion, one of patience, one of hospitality, one of forgiveness, one of sympathy and empathy, one of unity. I believe all of this that we can do. But we need, you and I, to commit, to say that God, in view of God's mercy, I understand what it is that you desire for us, and I'm in, and I desire to serve you with the proper worship that you desire. Let's pray.